Hey, welcome to the Church Explained podcast, a conversation to grow your leadership and build your church. We're excited today. We're going to focus around this idea of how to grow a healthy church, and we've got an amazing guest from Hillsong Network, Andy Hopper. So let's get ready for the show today. Hey, well, so good today to have Andy Hopper with us. He's going to be on the podcast today. It's going to be an exciting podcast. Andy is the team leader of the Hillsong Leadership Network, an important role. And he does a lot of stuff around connecting with leaders, training, really trying to help churches grow in their principles and practices to get them really to a healthy place. So we're going to touch on some of that stuff today. Just to say, Andy is originally from the UK. That's what we've been told. Although, let's listen to his accent, if he really is from the UK. Maybe he was 2 or something. Let's find out in a minute. His wife is Naomi, and they live in Sydney, and they've got 3 young kids. So, Andy, welcome to the Church Explained podcast. It's so good to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank God for technology that allows us to chat and distribute this out to wherever you're listening in the world.
Yeah, it's amazing. Andy, why don't you just tell us a little bit more about yourself, when you moved to maybe Australia, and your family and your role?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I did grow up near Birmingham. I don't have the Brummie accent, never did, but in Solihull. And moved to Australia when I was 19 years old, all by myself. And so been here now for nearly 16 years. And so met my wife, Naomi, while I was studying here at Hillsong College. And so she's a Latina from the USA. And so it's a bit of a blend of cultures of English and Latina and American living in Australia. And we've got 3 young kids that are 6, 3, and 2.
Oh, wow.
And yes, so that's fun. It's been a fun 18 months of lockdown with them. And so, so I moved in 16 years ago, did Hillsong College, worked for a property developer and a small business coach after that. And then 8 years ago, joined the staff of Hillsong Church. Yeah.
Wow.
Fantastic. So you must have been from the posh part of Birmingham then, were you, if you didn't have an accent?
That's what they do say of Solihull, yeah.
We'll say no more. Yeah. So listen, tell us a little bit about, you've mentioned about your journey going to Hillsong. You went to, I think, Hillsong College, you were saying there. Tell us a little bit more maybe about what it's like being in Hillsong in Sydney, and about your role, your current role. That would be great for our listeners to hear today.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess the role, it's quite diverse, as I'm sure most people's roles are. But ultimately, it's to show people behind the scenes of Hillsong, what we do, why we do it. Because I think people could look at Hillsong, particularly as it's grown over the last few decades, and they look at it as this big corporate church where it's like, if you've got questions, where would I ask those questions to? Who could I possibly get in contact with to find things out? And so the cool thing about the network existing is that our board and senior pastors have it on their heart to champion the cause of local churches everywhere. And so we as a team are able to answer those questions and facilitate those answers, and also facilitate relationship with leaders around the world so that we can hang out together, or at least pre-COVID we could, and they can really catch the culture of Hillsong. And so, one of the things I did, I think, during COVID was kind of really narrow down what is it that I would say, what's that one sentence in terms of what is it that I do? And I came up with this, and it's that I facilitate environments where leaders can catch Hillsong culture. Great. Facilitate environments where leaders can catch Hillsong culture. And so I guess prior to COVID, that incorporated quite a bit of travel. Now it's more through Zoom and podcasts and things like that. But that's that's kind of the vague answer to it. And maybe something that's helpful is something that inspired me being part of Hillsong, having come from a smaller church, from a New Frontiers church, particularly based in the UK. And then, for me, I would go to the Global Leadership Summit. My mum would take me out of school as a 14-year-old to go to Global Leadership Summit. Then when I was 17, read Purpose Driven Church and kind of redesigned our youth ministry along those lines. Wow. And then came to study at Hillsong. And so for me, I feel like I have this ecumenical mindset of learning from everyone, and there is no perfect way of doing church, and just wanting to help as many people as possible. And so I heard this story from Elon Musk. And so, we used to say that Elon Musk, we knew of him because of like Tesla. Now it's because of SpaceX and naming his kid and all these other kinds of things and cryptocurrency and whatever. But he was asked on a late night TV show, he was asked why he'd given the patents to Tesla away to all of his competitors. So yes, all this IP that Tesla had created about the electric vehicles, why had he given it away to all of these other competitors? And he gave this really powerful answer. And he gave this analogy of, if you're on a sinking ship and you discover this like secret design for a baler, like a bucket that's going to get, twice as much water out than the guy behind you, is like, you'd be crazy not to share that with everyone else, because ultimately the ship's going down, like the ship's going to sink unless you do. And so to relay that to electric vehicles in the environment, he's obviously saying like Tesla can't do it all by themselves. It's like they need all of the car makers to go on this journey with them. And so that really inspired me about the thought of the church and about Hillsong Church and these other churches that I mentioned and networks that exist and podcasts like this. It's all about equipping one another and sharing these things that we've learned along the way that are going to help all of us stop this, not that the ship is sinking, but like the world is sinking and we've all got to work together. It can't just be like Hillsong's got this great idea of how church is done and we're not going to tell anyone else, or, Life Church, or you name it.
Yeah.
We got to share that stuff. And so that's the heart of our senior pastors, Brian and Bobby Houston. It's what I very fortunately get to essentially spend my whole life doing through the network. And it's a huge privilege.
That's amazing. And what a great attitude to have. In terms of building the church. You mentioned there around lots of churches and leaders will ask you questions. So I wonder if you just touch on maybe some of the most frequently asked questions that you get, and like, are they around certain topics?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I think generally, people will be impressed by Hillsong and some of the branding and communication and the worship maybe, but when they kind of get down to nitty gritty, the three things that they're always asking are essentially, how do we do small groups better and discipleship? How do we, get more volunteers? We don't have enough volunteers. And 3, how do we look after new people? It kind of always boils down to those kinds of 3 things: small groups, volunteers, and new people. And, I think generally leaders can be looking for a little bit of like talk about the silver bullet. What's this system or this program or the software that Hillsong uses or that this other church uses, this program, and that's going to solve all of our problems. And the truth is there's nothing like that. And what people don't realize maybe about Hillsong is just how hard we just work at those things. Like it's just good old hard work, sweat, energy, analysis, and work. And there's nothing really glamorous or super secret about that. It's just that we love people. We love discipling people. We believe that people's lives are going to get bigger if they serve others and serve God, serve the church. And so we just work really, really hard at those things. And so I guess people think that, maybe the secret to Hillsong is our worship or a certain preaching style. But it's actually just working really hard at the same thing that every other church has to work hard at: small groups, volunteers, and looking after new people. And then probably one of the other things that more recently people start asking about is how do you start reproducing your culture all around the world, as Hillsong's opened up so many more locations in different cities and nations around the world. It's just like, I think people are often kind of surprised that it's possible, or wonder how that works in terms of reproducing that same culture of like, this feels like home wherever you are in the world.
So just picking up on that, because that's a great place just to think through it a little bit. How do you do that? Because obviously if you put aside the small groups, the volunteers and the teams, I think they're essential. If we think of multi-site churches, or just maybe even churches who maybe just even want to open another campus somewhere, maybe they're not going to become a major multi-site, but they think, okay, we want to plant somewhere, we want to do something, we want to carry the same culture. For you guys then, what, I know there's no silver bullet, but what would you say is the common ingredient?
Yeah. It's a great point you make about, it's not just about planting churches on the other side of the world, but it could even just be, starting an evening service from just having a morning service, or starting a second morning service. Some of those things, it still needs to be reproduced even just an hour and a half later. But it is an enormous question, and we could do a whole week-long seminar on it, really. And if it was easy, then everyone would be doing it. Yeah. But I think there are some aspects that maybe are undervalued that I could share on, and just humbly from my experience, because it's really Brian and Bobby are the ones that are the genius behind it. But I think the first thing for us is that our goal is for it to be the same culture. So whether it's a morning and a night service, or it's a campus in another part of city or nation, it's actually our goal that it would be the same culture, because not every movement does it like that, and not every movement has to do it like that.
No.
Or church. There's so many models of doing it, but what you'd hear at Hillsong is that we're one house and many rooms. And so if that is our goal, that we are one house, we're one church, then that means that we are aiming for the same culture in every service, campus, nation. And then to take this picture of the house, which Pastor Bobby so beautifully talks about, because a house alludes to a family living in a house. And so that's what Hillsong is. It's sons and daughters of the house. And so oftentimes you see in these new locations that we're starting in, it's a son and daughter of the house that has been sent to plant that church, to expand the culture. And so the thing about a son and daughter in Hillsong is oftentimes they've been part of Hillsong for 10, 15, 20 plus years.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so they are the culture. It's not just like they know it theoretically or they read the book on it. It's like they've proven themselves to be the culture. And now it's a very low risk sending them over there, because they are us. They almost like they unconsciously just be the culture. And so, at Hillsong, there is no, rule book or 1,000 rules, and for every single scenario, this is how you do it.
Yeah.
But there's just kind of gut instinct reactions where things happen, or people suggest things, or you see something, you go, that's not who we are. That's not the way we do it. So I guess all that to say is sometimes, like, I encourage churches that are maybe 3-5 years old that want to plant a church, whether it's on the other side of the city or other side of the world, is I go like, you just got to accept that that's going to be hard work. I'm not saying don't do it, but it's going to require massive intentionality, because you only have maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years worth of enculturation. Your sons and daughters of the house are only, a few years into it. There might be toddlers, to use that picture.
Yeah.
And so, so one of the things about Hillsong is that really, like, the first 20, 25 years is we didn't really plant that many Hillsong locations. We did plant churches, but we didn't plant a lot of Hillsong locations within that first 20 years. But now you see the last decade and how it's expanded like crazy. But it's because there's this whole generation of sons and daughters that have grown up, been born, saved into the culture, and are now able to expand it relatively rapidly, because it's just who they are. We're not hiring someone in from the outside and giving them the playbook. It's just who they are.
I think that's
Brilliant.
amazing.
Yeah,
Such great thought around sons and daughters of the house, and carrying that culture, I think, is amazing. Just in terms of your role and overseeing that Hillsong Leadership Network, I guess you've seen the temptation for leaders to copy from Hillsong or other successful, fruitful churches. I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about whether that's okay or if it's not okay, and just the reasoning behind that.
Great question.
Yeah, it's good. It's a great question. Yeah, I think it depends on where your heart is. So I'd say there's two sides to it. So there's the side of, we're going to learn from and copy another, successful church, influential church, because like the Elon Musk example of because of the mission demands it, and we want to use everything that we possibly can to achieve the mission. Or there's the side of going that's, I can't be bothered to think for myself of what might work, and so I'm just going to look around and see what anyone else is doing. Or I'm just going to look for that silver bullet so I don't have to work as hard. So I think it depends on the spirit with which you bring to it. But I think if you do have the right spirit, then I think it's about being able to distinguish between something that Pastor Robert Ferguson, who's our teaching pastor at Hillsong, he calls the 3 Ps. And so I actually already referenced it, I think maybe in your introduction to my bio, in terms of teaching churches the principles and the practices. Yeah. And so those are actually the first and the third P. So these 3 Ps are the principles, the patterns, and the practices. And so Pastor Robert, he talks about principles as being these eternal principles that work in all situations, all circumstances for eternity. You've got patterns that work at certain times, and certain circumstances that aren't, some of them might be eternal, kind of God-breathed, and some might not. And then you've got practices that are really just kind of man-made. They work only in specific times and certain circumstances. And so if I was to break that down for you, give you an example of, say, a church copies Hillsong that has a heart and soul night. And so they go, Hillsong does heart and soul nights, and therefore if we do that, we will grow, we will be healthy, we'll be successful, whatever. And they don't realize, well, that's just a practice. That's something that we've invented for now, and in a year's time could completely change how we do it. But then there's the pattern. So a pattern is a level above that, and it alludes to something a bit more eternal, something that is more reproducible throughout history, throughout church, which is that there is a core to your church that are looking for inspiration and being part of a community. And then there's an overarching principle, which is that community, that we're made for community, that God has designed the church to serve one another and for it to be a body and a family. And so all that to say, if you go, well, we're going to do a heart and soul night, but there's actually and so you use the logo and the branding and whatever, but when you get to it, there's no sense of, this is family, this is fun, this is a level of vulnerability, transparency, community building. If you haven't got that, ultimately it comes from a revelation. And so I think that's the thing of people, copy from Hillsong, copy from Life Church or Saddleback or whoever, but try and get their original revelation of why are they doing it like that? Yeah. What was their reason for deciding it to look like that? And does that resonate with you? Is that the way that does that resonate with the revelation that God's given you for how your church is to function? And so in terms of copying, I think, essentially my role is to encourage people to copy Hillsong. But the thing is that Instagram it's a blessing and a curse. Yeah. Because I've seen over the last, few years as Instagram has grown so big is that people can see these other churches on Instagram. They see the crowd shots and the best shots and all those kinds of things and the branding for an event. And they go, yeah, we're going to do that. And they don't understand all the decisions that went in from that influential church of why are they doing it like that? What are the things they've wrestled with? What are the things they've said, we're not going to do it like that. We're going to do it like this because of the revelation that they have. And so if you just copy, if you haven't done any of that deep work in yourself to look at those 3 principles, is how does this work with the principles that we believe that the kingdom of God and the church needs to be built on, the patterns that God uses, and then the practices that are going to work in 2022 in Sydney that are going to be different to 1996 in London.
Yeah.
And we got to wrestle with those things, and Instagram kind of bypasses a whole lot of that. And so people can be copying for the wrong reasons and copying the wrong things, really.
It's great.
Yeah, some great insights there around that, practices and patterns. We've been talking a little bit about that ourselves here at the church. Yeah. So that's been useful for us as well right here. I mean, one of the things you said there, Andy, was the fact that, you're there to encourage people to copy Hillsong and copy the best practices. But I guess really the heart of it is really to dig down and get what is that principle, because that's the thing you're sharing, rather than just picking something up from Instagram or somewhere like that. Hey, we're going to dig deeper. And maybe that's a good thing for leaders to ask that question. Yeah. What is the principle decision before this? Because sometimes leaders can look and they can think, well, that looks great, I'm going to do that next Tuesday in my church, but they haven't really wrestled with, how did they get there? And I guess that's a good thing for people to think through. What do you think,
definitely.
Nathan?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just going back to that whole why we're doing something and that principle behind it. So what would you say to maybe a pastor who comes to you and they want to be more like Hillsong Church or maybe another influential church, and what would be like your conversation with them?
Yeah. Well, I always start by, acknowledging that it is beautiful that they would want to try and reproduce something of another church when it's, if they're reproducing something of heaven that they see displayed in that church. Hopefully they're not just copying just like, secular marketing practices, but they see a glimpse of like, oh, there's something in your atmosphere or your culture or the way in which you do discipleship that echoes something of heaven. And so can you tell me more about it? I'd love it. I'd love us to look more like, really they're saying is like, I'd love to look more like heaven and the kingdom of God more than there's just like a church that's kind of a layer in there. But really what they see through that is they see heaven. I remember there was an example of, a very globally significant church that I'm sure like 99% of your listeners and viewers would know. And one of their team asked me about how Hillsong did guest relations, which is really like hosting if there's a guest speaker that's coming through and speaking on a Sunday. And so they'd experience what that felt like at Hillsong. And so their team were asking me like, hey, can you give us like the playbook and the map out? Because we want to start doing our guest relations the way that you do it. And that's what I said to them was like, I can set up a conversation so you can understand some of the stuff behind the scenes, why we do that. And it's beautiful that you would say that of our church. But what you've got to understand, and it comes back to this kind of the principles and the revelation, is that the way we look after our guests and our guest speakers is the exact same way that Pastor Bobby, our senior pastor, would look after anyone who visited her house. So it's not like we just have all these ideas and practices of what we do because they're a guest speaker, and we've just invented that out of nowhere. That originates out all the way back to a Hillsong church with dozens of people and Pastor Bobby and the revelation of the church being a home, the church being a family, hospitality, a sense of welcome home, you belong here. And so she does that for one person in our home, and we're able to just replicate that for a guest speaker. Great. But also we're replicating that for thousands of people that come to church into an auditorium on a weekend. Is that Pastor Bobby would say, you're coming into a lounge room, you're coming into Pastor Brian and Bobby's lounge room. If people come to our conference, whether it be in an arena, in Sydney or London or New York and 20,000 people, is that you're getting the same kind of welcome that you're getting from Pastor Bobby if you were in a home. And so any church that's kind of, looking to learn from Hillsong is, as I would ask, well, you as a senior pastor, or if it's one of their team members, is, well, what does your senior pastor want? What are they like? What is their personality? What are their values? And so, because you're not necessarily going to be able to reproduce Hillsong unless it's actually deep inside and it's one of your values and the principles that you believe that your church should be built on. So I kind of always kind of put it back onto people and go, well, like, who are you? Like, discover who you are. What does guest relations look like for you? What does connect groups look like for you? What does a service run sheet look like for you? It's going to come out of you as a person and what God's told you, not from what God's told someone else.
Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that's great stuff there, Andy. I like that idea that it's in the person, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I suppose that's discipleship as well. That's how discipleship runs and works, isn't it? Like it needs to be inside the person for it to be seen. And just to have that idea of the house is a great image. And maybe that's something that leaders can be asking themselves as well, like what am I replicating, or what are people replicating from me?
Yeah.
Is a big thing as well, because often if it's not in the church, the question we have to go back to is it in the leader?
Yeah.
And that's not a judgment, but that's just a reality check,
Yeah.
You can't say to, people in the church, hey, be super generous if the leaders aren't super generous. It just doesn't work, does it?
No.
You can have a playbook, and as you say, to say do these 5 things, but deep down, if it's not in the leaders, it will never transpire elsewhere, will it?
No.
Yeah. Hey, another question. We're just thinking on this idea of networks and leaders, and it's an important thing for leaders to have networks. What would you say is the value? Obviously, you're dealing with a lot of churches, some who are part of the Hillsong network, some are exploring. You're probably dealing with lots of people at different stages of their journey. What would you say is the importance of being connected to a network, Andy?
Yeah, I think something I noticed as I took on this role and started to get to know more leaders is just finding that so many of them are lonely. I think Hillsong's a little bit sheltered in that because we are this big, large family of all these locations and in cities and nations, is that you have all these peers as a key leader. You have all these peers that you can rely on. But for a lot of senior leaders, if you're the senior pastor and you're kind of a church by yourself, there's no one else you can be vulnerable with, that you can share what's really going on with. And so it can really feel like you're alone. No one understands you, and there's no one that you can share and be transparent with. And so I think the value of a network is that you can have other people at your level of leadership. The church can be different sizes, but understanding the weight that you both feel, that you can just be real around. You can find your tribe, people that you can be comfortable with, you can be yourself with. I think that's incredibly important for leaders. So I'd say that's one thing, is just noticing, even pre-COVID, just leadership can be lonely if you choose to allow it to continue to be lonely. It doesn't have to be. The other thing about the network is, I've mentioned a few times, is this idea of really just not needing to reinvent the wheel. Is that there's other people that have tried other things and have analyzed and learned stuff. And so rather than going through all the same process yourself, is that you can learn from others. And the value of being a network is it's not just about you receiving information from someone else, but you can also pass it on to others. And so it's reciprocal, and you build this web, this network where everyone's learning and helping with one another. And then I guess one of the final things I think is, depending on the kind of network that you're part of, it also just helps in the calendar of, it puts breaks and these milestones in your calendar of whatever events those are. If maybe it's an annual conference or a monthly webinar, just put something in your calendar where you go, I'm going to keep learning. I'm going to rest. I'm going to refresh myself. Hopefully you're in an environment that's going to re-energize you and inspire you, not bring you down. Sadly, maybe some denominations, when you hang out with one another, it brings you down more than it lifts you. And so sometimes, experience that of some denominations, some churches, they come to Hillsong Network to be re-energized and refreshed because they can't necessarily get that from their own denomination, which is sad. And so I think between those 3 things, I think it can be really valuable being part of a network.
Yeah. No, some great thoughts, and been some great thoughts throughout the podcast. Just to finish, Andy, I wonder if you'd had any advice for anyone who may be looking at starting a network, or even for someone who's, leading a network, and just any advice for anyone in that situation.
Yeah. Well, my first piece of advice, don't do it. Not really, but a little bit. No, I would check with people like, is there already demand for what you believe God's put on your heart? Like, is there people that are already knocking on your door, asking questions, asking you for coffee. Is there a sense of a hunger for what it is that you have to offer? That's really, Hillsong Network started out of that, was just that as Hillsong was gaining more traction around the world and people were asking questions, and Christine Kane was actually leading it back in the day. And it's like, there's only so many coffee catch-ups you can have. There's only so many emails you can respond to. And so the way of putting the network together was to kind of leverage some of our resources to be able to help as many people as possible. And so I would ask that question to people of, is there already a demand, or is it just a thought in your head and no one's actually asking you those questions yet? But assuming that there is some demand and people are looking to you, is that every network's going to be so different, and you can really shape it to what you want it to look like. And so I thought of some of these things that you might want to think of in terms of your network, and whether it's designing it from scratch or reshaping it. Which even during COVID, the last 18 months, I feel like we've been reshaping or really aligning, clarifying Hillsong Network. But so things like, how big do you want this to be? Because it can be smaller, it can be big, it can be very scalable, or you might intentionally choose that this thing actually doesn't scale, beyond. Actually, the maximum size of this is 7 people. You might decide, or it could be 700 people. It's not necessarily right or wrong. So how personal do you want it to be? Do you want it to be incredibly personal, where the only way you do it is by getting together in one another's homes, or can you be anywhere in the world and you don't know everyone else who's part of it? How leveraged do you want it to be? How centralized? Do you want, Hillsong Network is relatively centralized in that the majority of the information is flowing out of Hillsong to these other churches, but then there's other networks where every church is kind of contributing to it. So it's not as centralized. What kind of commitment levels required? Is it that you have to show up at every single meeting and it's every other week, or is it once a year? How much commonality do you expect there to be between the leaders? Is it great commonality where people are like, no, this is my tribe? Or is it actually quite diverse, that you find a whole lot of different voices, personalities? Is it physical, or is it online? Is it local? Is it global? Is it for anyone, or is it only by application? And, as soon as you start to identify and pick, I'm definitely, that on that one, kind of in the middle on this thing, then it shapes a really unique network that best describes you, your personality, your vision, your goals for ministry, and allows you to stay true to your grace zone. And that's the biggest thing. It's like, don't try and be like another network. Stay true to your grace zone, what God's put on your life and your ministry, and have great confidence that it's going to help a lot of leaders.
Andy, that's fantastic advice, I think, and some great insights there, especially around that idea of, if people aren't asking it from you, really, do you really want to start something? Because I think there's got to be that demand. Like, if people are knocking on your door, that's a good indication. If they're not, don't just go and write a playbook, as we've said earlier, and think this is what I'm going to do, because probably people won't turn up. They're connected, and it's all that sort of stuff of that personal connection, isn't it, really? Hey, and it's been brilliant to have you on this podcast, Church Explained podcast. We're going to wrap up in a second. But first of all, I think we want to say thank you to you, Andy, and to Hillsong as well, for all the stuff you guys have contributed to the wider church over the last 20 so years. To be honest, we're not sort of bigging you up for the sake of it, but it is pretty remarkable, and we have benefited of that definitely, as a local church, haven't we? And it's good for churches just to say thank you to you guys for all the stuff that you've done for the wider church. Honestly, it's just been such a blessing to have someone like yourselves out there who've helped pave the way for lots of stuff for leaders and churches. Hey, thank you for that. We really do appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on. Really appreciate that, and thank you for what you do as well.
No, brilliant. Andy, if people want to kind of get in touch with you, or just see you about, how would they do that?
I think going to probably network.hillsong.com, probably the best place to check out a whole lot of free stuff there from Hillsong, and different avenues to connect. So network.hillsong.com.
Great stuff. Well, that's it for this Church Explained podcast. As we've said, it's been great to have Andy with us. And if you, wherever you're tuning into this, if you could rate, review, subscribe, that helps us get the podcast out. You'll find the show notes in the comments and the notes below. And you can check out Andy at network.hillsong.com, but also you can check out icon.church/open, where you'll find the show notes for this episode, but also past episodes, and also free resources on there. It's been great to be together, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Church Explained podcast.